But tonight we have a very special guest to introduce our distinguished panel of authors, a distinguished gentleman himself. He is the managing editor of the Miami Herald. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Rick Hurst.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks, everybody. It's always a pleasure to be at Books and Books, and tonight for me is a little more special. I get to introduce a great new thriller, High Hand, and solve a little mystery, and what avid reader and journalist wouldn't want to do that? So first, the mystery. The author, Curtis James. There are three of them. No, who the heck is he? We could answer that with a joke. A reporter, a scientist, and a union expert walk into a bar. Hours and pitchers of beers later, they leave, and there's an outline for a spy novel. And that sounds a little crazy, but as you'll hear, that's kind of the way it happened. So back to Curtis James. Unless you accidentally were trapped in this reading, you know that Curtis James is a pseudonym for our three authors who collaborated on this thriller. So who are they? Really, you hear about their backgrounds, and it would be a really unlikely group of people to be together unless you lived and worked in Washington, D.C., and then it's a little less so. And I guess in Washington, it's typical to have a group of guys like this hanging around together. But I'll let them tell their story themselves in a minute. But here's their background, and I'll start with Dr. Harris, our physician scientist. Kurt Harris is known around the world for his work in cancer research. He's made contributions to the field of molecular carcinogenesis, molecular epidemiology. It's a challenge for me. Human cancer and clinical cancer research. He's collaborated with leading researchers in this field in the US, Europe, the former Soviet Union, the Middle East, Asia, and he's traveled extensively to all those regions. He's published more than 500 journal articles, more than 100 book chapters. He's edited 10 books. He holds more than 25 advanced biotechnology patents owned by the US government. Too bad. He's also the chief of the Laboratory of Human Carcinogenesis at the NIH, National Cancer Institute, and is adjunct professor of oncology at Georgetown University School of Medicine. Not bad. Next, James Ellenberger. James worked for nearly 30 years in numerous capacities with the National AFL-CIO. He was responsible for Asian affairs in the organization's international section and was assistant director of occupational safety and health. He was a senior analyst for unemployment insurance, workmen's compensation, and disability issues. He later served 4 years as deputy commissioner of the Virginia Employment Commission under Governor Mark Warner. He's a Vietnam War veteran. He's traveled extensively in Asia and the Middle East, and he's written widely on labor affairs, social insurance, and medical care for injured workers. He's also a founding member of the National Academy of Social Insurance. Finally, James Rosen. Jim, how did you meet these guys? So Jim, and if his co-authors will forgive me, you'll want to know I want you to know Jim for reasons that go beyond this book. Jim is a longtime Washington correspondent for the McClatchy Company. In D.C., he's covered the Pentagon, Congress for the Kansas City Star, Sacramento Bee, and 26 other McClatchy newspapers. He's been a frequent contributor to the Tribune News Services, U.S. and international media clients, some 1,200 of those. He's received 2 awards from the National Press Club for political reporting, something called the McClatchy President's Award for coverage of the 2000 post-election Florida recount. Remember that? And before coming to Washington, he was an editor for the Raleigh News and Observer and a reporter for the New York Daily News. He holds a master's degree from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism And he's fluent in Russian. At one point, he was Moscow correspondent for UPI. But most important to me, and maybe to some of you, in January, Jim became the Miami Herald's Washington, D.C. correspondent. So you may have already seen his work on our website and in the Miami Herald. You may have seen it before when he was just part of McClatchy's Washington Bureau. But now you'll see much more as he covers Washington with an eye towards what you're interested here in South Florida. So it's a pleasure to introduce the three men who are the brains behind Curtis James. Gentlemen, maybe just kick things off by describing exactly how the three of you got together.
That's loud. We had all been playing squash for several years, and become friendly over squash court, competitive but friendly matches, and beer afterwards, and sometimes dinner and so forth. And I used to complain. The Yiddish word is kvetch. I used to complain to these two fine gentlemen that my job in journalism didn't give me time to write a book, which is what I really wanted to do. That's what all journalists want to do, really. And now many of them are being forced to do that. But at any rate, I think Kurt in particular got tired of me complaining about this and not doing anything about it. And so one night we were having beers in the cafe of the club where we played, still play squash, and he took a sheaf of paper out of his inside coat pocket, and he handed it to me, and I said, "What's that?" And he said, "That's your book." And it was a 3-page single-space outline of a book idea, which really is the kind of the skeleton idea for the book you're looking at. And I didn't immediately take Kurt up on his offer. And after asking me several times and me telling him that I was looking at it and giving it serious thought and so forth, he finally said to me, "Well, if you're not interested in it, I can find somebody who is." And that got my attention. So fast forward, we decided we'd ask Jim, also a good friend of ours and fellow squash partner, to join us. And we would start off by going up into the mountains, the Shenandoah Mountains, rent a rustic cabin for 4 days, and try to flesh out a detailed outline of the novel. And what's that? Right. And that's what we did. We went up we rented a cabin. We worked 14 hours a day for 3.5 days. And by the end of the weekend, we had a pretty detailed outline of the novel. It's undergone significant changes since then. It's including 2 extensive revisions, but really the basis of it was established during that weekend. So, I don't know. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Kurt?
Well, one of the aspects of this is, of course, there's 3 of us, and how do 3 people get together to write a novel? And Jim outlined the details of it. And then, did we have any arguments? Maybe we did. Maybe we didn't. That's for you to ask, and maybe we can tell you some details.
Well, the amazing thing is that you take 3 guys who are friends on and off the squash court and sit down and try and write a book. And it does test your friendship. And I guess one of the measures of the depth of our friendship is that we're still friends after this process. It took a long time to flesh it out. Jim mentioned the genesis of it. We did meet at the cabin, took everything off the walls, put up poster paper, really did extensive outlines and assignments, who is going to write what. And of course that changed over time, but basically we doled it out in thirds and did our assignments, and we decided early on, and I think this was a key part of our ability to write a novel, 3 people. I mean, you hear of 2 people collaborating on a novel, but rarely do you hear of 3 people collaborating on a novel. I think one of the keys is that we decided early on that Jim Rosen, being the professional writer, would be the one to put it into a single voice, make sure that a reader reading this would not immediately pick up different nuances or tones or styles that would puzzle them and perhaps encourage them to put the book down and not go forward. So it was a challenge. Now, I do want to say one thing about squash. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the game of squash rackets. It's now generically called squash. Squash is played in an indoor court, 4 walls, front wall, back wall, side walls. And it's a very fast game. It's played with a hollow ball that is described as a dead ball. It doesn't bounce very high. It warms up. It moves very quickly. When you hit it, it frequently exceeds 100 miles an hour. If it hits you, you know it hit you.
When you hit it, Jim. Don't speak for others.
And you have to move around a lot on a squash court. There's a thing called the tee in the court, and a key to the game is to dominate the tee. You hit a shot, you move back to the tee, and then you move forward to retrieve a drop shot or back to get a shot off the back wall. And so you're constantly moving. And Forbes magazine once described squash as perhaps the best sport for exercise because of its aerobic exercise, and it's good for your heart. It's good for your general well-being. And looking at us, I'm sure you can agree.
So let me expand that just briefly. Collaboration. In my line of work, I collaborate with people all over the world, and doing studies, either clinical studies or population studies of why some people get cancer and some don't get cancer. And the key to that is to find partners that have skills and expertise that's complementary to what you have, put it together, and you have synergy. And that's our objective in High Hand. And I think you have to read it, but I think we accomplished that.
And we wanted to make this a conversation, a back and forth exchange. So I don't know what the procedure for answering questions is, but we have plenty of more we can say. But we'd like to invite you all to ask any questions. I guess you're supposed to ask them into the microphone, but does anyone have any?
I'm going to give it to you in a second. Curtis James. Who's Curtis James? How'd you come up with the name Curtis James?
It's Curtis J. James. So it's an amalgam of our 3 first names. So
I've read a number of reviews or puffies, whatever you call them, about the book, so I have a general sense. And my question is, which part of the crew brought what I would call the technical knowledge of a spy story to this novel? I guess they call it the tradecraft. I could have, but I didn't.
That's why we love him.
I guess that's fine. So there's been intertwining of science and spies for centuries. And the technology, of course, has gotten much better. And maybe tradecraft, there's basic tradecraft, which is, human to human. But the technology has certainly has benefited the spy community. So the idea was that we needed to have some sort of technology as part of this world. And so invented something called the X-Wave. And it's an electronic toolbox for spies. And it has a number of important capabilities, some that are revealed in this book and some that will be revealed in the next one. But I'll just name three. The first is facial recognition that I'm sure all of you are very familiar with. I became familiar with that more than 20 years ago when I was reviewing some of the work that was being done at that point, and it's evolved very significantly since then. The second, which is very timely and something that we foretold, is encryption and busting encryption. And this is, of course, Apple versus the FBI and the other giants in the field that have joined Apple. And the news about this was, of course, the terrorist who killed a number of people in California. And so the question is, can we open up his encrypted cell phone? So the high hand has a malleable backdoor software program that actually busts open encrypted both messages as well as verbal communication. A third capability is telepathic communication. And that's primarily known as brain-to-computer interaction. And this has been something of spy novels and spy movies for science fiction movies for a long time. But it's actually reality now. And the reality is the people who've come back from the various wars that we've been involved with and are still involved with, who have lost limbs or have lost their ability to move their limbs. So the technology uses brain waves going to exoskeleton that allows these people to start walking again, or to be able to move their arms and grasp things. So this is the reality of it stands today. It's still in phase 1, phase 2 kinds of studies that haven't gone to all of our veterans yet that need it, but hopefully that will happen. And so it plays an important part. The telepathic communication plays an important part at several places in the novel.
So I think you were also asking about the spycraft, perhaps, and I think we all have relationships, both personal and professional, with people, broadly speaking, who have some relationship to the intelligence community. If you live in Washington, you can't go to a dinner party without running into spies. Right, right. And they won't always tell you they're spies, but you get pretty good at sussing them out after a while. But my first, as a reporter, my first introduction and interaction with spies was actually in Moscow, when I got to know some very senior, at the time, Soviet intelligence people. And what was fascinating was that as the Soviet Union crumbled, as the Communist Party crumbled and collapsed, you actually, some of the first people who defected were the spies, because they knew where the bodies were buried. They knew a lot, and they did not want to be, to use a kind of a Donald Trump kind of phrase, they didn't want to be the last rats off the ship. So they were, it was very surprising, but they actually started talking to reporters, Western reporters, before a number of other people started talking to Western reporters. And a lot of our understanding of the government and how it really worked versus how they said it worked came from the intelligence community. And I think one of the things that's most gratifying, at least to me, and I don't want to speak for Jim and Kurt, but one of the things that's most gratifying is that if you look on the cover, there's what did you call it, sir? You called it a puffy, but there's a testimonial from, for instance, John Rizzo. And John Rizzo, who I've covered as a journalist, was the former general counsel, the top lawyer for the CIA, and he was in the middle of, his memoirs came out just a couple years ago, and he was in the middle of the CIA's decisions, for good and for bad, to use the rough, let's call them rough interrogation techniques against alleged terrorists after 9/11. But he said to us, and it meant a lot to us, that we got the spycraft right, and that he was impressed by that. And we've heard that from actually a fair number of former very senior intelligence people, not just in the United States, but also in Russia, where I still have some contacts, that they really are amazed that three people who ostensibly have no background in intelligence got the spycraft so right. So that. Right.
Spies, please raise their hand.
So we do have intelligence, but we're not members of the intelligence community. And I'll just amplify something that Jim said. I get hooked on these kinds of novels by reading Le Carrier at a young age. And George Smiley, of course, is his famous spy. And he's deceptively ordinary. And the spies I've met work for the MI6, for example, and some of them undercover as non-official cover kinds of people. They are deceptively ordinary, but they're not ordinary at all.
I'm a little reluctant to speak to the issue of spycraft, but might surprise most of you that during the Cold War, the American labor movement was very engaged in an international battle with the communist-controlled labor movement, which was directed out of Moscow through Prague through an organization called the World Federation of Trade Unions. I started out in the international division of the AFL-CIO. My first boss was a fellow by the name of Jay Lovestone. And I imagine in this store there are a few books that probably mention more than a few things about Jay Lovestone. Jay Lovestone was one of the co-founders of the American Communist Party. He was eventually the chairman of the party, and he went to Moscow with Bertram Wolfe, a very famous American author, who made a revolution, for example, wrote the definitive biographies of Diego Rivera, the great Mexican muralist who was also a communist. Anyhow, Jay and Bert went to Moscow for a Comintern meeting in 1928, and Joseph Stalin purged Lovestone from his leadership position as the head of the American Communist Party because Jay was arguing for American exceptionalism. I'm not going to bore you with the story about that. Jay and Bert had to surreptitiously sneak out of the Soviet Union. When he got back, he formed what was called the CPO, the Communist Party Opposition. And eventually, when it became very clear what Stalin was doing to the opposition, Jay was actually a supporter of Nikolai Bukharin. When Lovestone and his followers, who were known as Lovestonites, found out what was happening in the Soviet Union, people were being killed and banished to the camps. They broke with communism and became virulently anti-communist. And eventually, Jay went to work for David Dubinsky at the ILGWU, and Dubinsky introduced him to George Meany, and George Meany hired him as the director of the international department. That's sort of a long introduction to sort of Cold War struggles. I worked in the Philippines for a couple of years for the AFL-CIO with unions in the Philippines. And I'll never forget, someone came up and asked my daughter, who at the time was 5 years old, she's now 46, asked her, "Who does your daddy work for?" And she said, "The AFL-CIA."
Yeah. Yeah. There's, Jim's not going to say this, but there is one of these books at this store about Lovestone, which says "My Covert Life," and there's quite a bit of evidence that he worked for the CIA. Of course, my friend here.
Thank you. I don't usually need a microphone, but you know, our friends on the internet. Well, Don asked the question that I was going to ask first, so he leaves me to the girly question. Oh, by the way, y'all aren't in D.C., you're in South Florida. Not everybody agrees with you that communism's gone, and I'm just going to leave it at that with a backdrop of national election with the hashtag. My question is, clearly from your resumes, a bunch of underachievers. Journalists aren't the only people that have something to say or think they do, even worse. Some combination of what does it feel like and what was the process like to take it from here's an idea to look at y'all. You're sitting behind an actually published book at a reading in Miami, Coral Gables, not even Miami. So congratulations, but what is that like? And I'm not asking too much of a girly question. You don't really have to tell me, but that's a remarkable thing. So I'm just interested in how, I know some of y'all still do some of what you do. Yeah, After the Cabin, how'd that get from that to a pretty published book? The sequel.
I think After the Cabin, we might have just come up with the title of the next book, but so we have a publicist, book promoter who's actually based in Miami, Javier Perez, and he's got an interesting. I'm finding out everybody in Miami has an interesting story. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why we ended up here. But he would probably not like me saying this, but we made mistakes. We made some mistakes along the way, and it was because we're each first-time authors, book authors, and we're accomplished in other fields. But we found out that there were a lot of things we didn't know about writing a book, and I'll just give a couple examples. One thing is that we started off by writing a screenplay, and we had the crazy idea that we would sell it and make $1 million or a couple $1 million. We'd sell it, and it would become a movie, and then we could write the book after that and maybe retire. And that didn't work out. But what the screenplay did do for us actually is it gave us the foundation, the skeleton of the book that you see. And we actually ended up with 53 or 54 real scenes in a screenplay with dialogue and some description and so forth. So when we went to write the book, we divided the scenes into 3, and we each wrote book chapters off of 17 or 18 scenes. We feel like when, I won't say if, when we write our next book, that we can skip the screenplay. We can do a detailed outline that maybe in a 4-day cabin session.
Did the research commensurate with your assignments versus I'm doing all the research and everybody uses it? You obviously shared what you learned, but.
So the question was, did we share what we learned? Well, I guess I need to elaborate a little bit on that. Yeah. We wrote the screenplay. We wrote the screenplay over. We actually sat together, the 3 of us, and wrote almost the entire screenplay together, sitting at the kitchen tables or the dining room tables in Kurt's home, Jim's home, and my home, and you know, I typed at a laptop because that's what I do. But we tried out dialogue, and so that was truly a collaborative effort. But we feel like we can shortcut that. The second thing we did that was, in retrospect, humorous, was we formed a company. We formed an LLC, a limited liability corporation based in Virginia, and we were told by a very talented lawyer who that if we're going to form a company, we needed to write or create what's called an operating agreement. And our operating agreement ended up being about 70 pages long, and so and it was all premised on the fact that we would actually someday make some money. A phase that we. Yes, and we hope we're now entering into that phase. It's been a while getting to it. But we actually had in fact, I would say that some of our strongest debates, believe it or not, were not artistic or creative debates over what should happen in the book, but debates over what we should do with money and how we should divide it, and things like it was kind of like the founding fathers in Philadelphia. I mean, I don't want to, but we talked we had very spirited discussions about whether, for instance, it should be the rule of simple majority. Should any creative decision that we made, any business decision that we made, should two people be allowed to, carry the day? Which would mean that one person would lose, and so we actually spent a long time hashing that out, and we came up with a hybrid system of sometimes it's 2 to 1, but sometimes it has to be consensus, and so on and so forth. So we have a very good business plan. If we sell the movie rights, and this book becomes a bestseller, we're well equipped to handle it.
And might not be a surprise to you, but we called our company Creative Joint Journey, or CJJ, CJ squared, Curtis J. James.
How long did it take you to get to the finished product from when you first met to?
The question is, how long did it take us to, from the start to the finished product? I think it's safe to say it took us a while. I've done 2 cross-country motorcycle trips since we started.
Because you started, or since you started?
I don't remember exactly how long it's been, but it was a while. And as Jim pointed out, we started out writing a screenplay. So in reality, we should subtract that from writing the novel, because it's so vastly different than a screenplay. But in reality, it was very important in terms of the preparation for the novel. Let me take a bye on answering that directly and pass it to Kurt.
Several years. Yeah, several actually.
More than.
So to go back to the screenplay, the book actually is being peddled right now not by other people to the movie industry and to the streaming Netflix and those kinds of people, and we'll see if something happens or not. We're always hopeful, though.
We have been told, and this is this is also gratifying, but we've been told by a number of readers, and I think you can see it in some of the reviews, that the book is cinematographic, that as they read it, they can picture it as a movie. So, do you want to?
What inspired you to write the outline? Did you have pre-record informal conversations, and then at some point you got inspired and wrote it down? What happened? How was the process?
So I I initiated the collaboration, and we all three of us have known each other for a very, very long time, and we've had our ups and downs and so on and so forth. And so I decided, wins and losses on the squash court. So as Jim said, I challenged him and presented the first storyline and the three strong characters in it, and three strong characters, three authors, and there's other threes that are associated with this book. So you could, but the three main characters are a publisher, you know, someone from the industry who is also associated with the CIA. His daughter, who is Lisa Hawks, and she is a female James Bond kind of character. She graduated from high school at 16. She was in the Olympics as the youngest person in the Olympics. She was the first youngest person to ever climb the big wall of El Capitan in Yosemite. She went to the farm, that's the CIA training facility, was the youngest person to graduate, and then she became a NOC, non-official cover. And that means being a spy without legal protection by the U.S. government. So that's a very strong character, and women read more of these kinds of novels than men do now. And the third, of course, is the recovering alcoholic reporter. And this is fictional. All of this is fictional. And that who is sometimes a romantic partner with Lisa and works for Lisa's father's newspaper. So we have this dynamic of these three kinds of things. I mean, these connections, and that leads the opportunity to write a prequel in which the Thomas Hawks, the publisher, could be the lead, and subsequent sequels in which could be either Lisa or Frank or the combination to move the stories forward.
So spoiler alert, they all live through the book?
They do live. A lot of other people don't, though.
One thing that I would like to add is that in terms of your question about an outline, is that the book is not a simple book. It's fairly complex. It takes place in a number of foreign countries. It takes place at different times over a 15 to 20 year period. There's a number of characters with funny foreign, unusual foreign names, and one of the things we've heard, a little bit criticism, is that it's too complicated. But believe it or not, it's actually considerably less complicated than it was at some point when we were really convinced it was too complicated. Right, and we just to give an example, and I don't think I'm giving anything away. We originally had some Chinese characters in it who are not in it anymore. They may reappear in the future. We had some of the action taking place in China, and we had more characters. We had more countries. We had more flashbacks. Going back into time from the current action. And one of the things that we did, because we heard this criticism repeat after we had the original draft of the book written, we gave it to perhaps altogether about a dozen people, family members, close friends, people whose opinions we valued, and we got very detailed feedback from them, and some of it was very candid, but the most consistent criticism that we got was that it jumped around too much in time. It was current action 6 years ago, current action 10 years ago, and that people would just get lost. I mean, and as a reader, when I read books, I kind of like that. I mean, I guess I like being a little disoriented, but trying to figure out. But we found out that a lot of readers don't particularly like that. So as you'll see when you read the book, we now have all of the action that does not take place in the current time, takes place over a period of years, is in one section of the book. And so we hope that helps.
Yes, in the back.
Why did you give up on the screenplay and go to the novel? And could you talk a little bit about writing a screenplay as opposed to writing a novel, the pros and cons or the difficulties?
Okay, so the question is, why did we give up the screenplay, and what are the pros and cons between a screenplay and a novel? The obvious things are that a novel allows you to go in much more depth in terms of the character development. And that was one of our objectives in this first book, was to really define the characters. And people who have read the book say that there's Graham Greene and others, that there's really depth in terms of the characters. The second is the screenplay allowed us to actually write a lot of dialogue, and we incorporated a number of that, some of that dialogue within the novel itself, and then build upon that. So it actually served a very useful purpose, and I think if we went back and wrote a screenplay today from the book, it would be quite good.
I'm just going to add that it's been a very educational process, and writing the screenplay first was an important part of that. We finished the screenplay, or what we thought was a finished product. We put it in what we thought was the proper format, and we circulated it to some agents, and very quickly learned that it was in the wrong format, and that we had done a number of other things incorrectly. And it was more than just a little embarrassing. We were trying to be professional about this. And so we went back to the drawing board, and as Kurt said, we rethought it, and we realized that the screenplay, as good as we thought it was weak in areas that really troubled us. And the most important part of that was our ability to develop the depth around a character that you need to have people understand the motives of a character. And that's something that you really have to write a book in order to accomplish.
This is somewhat related. There's one way in which we got very lucky with this book, which is that when we started working on it, the Cold War had been over for quite a while, and Russia had receded from a lot of Americans' attention span and memory even, and it seemed to be kind of a backwater regional power, as President Obama famously referred to it at one point. And I still cared a great deal about Russia because I had been based there. I still have friends and contacts in not only in Moscow but throughout Russia. But I think it was no longer this kind of famous mysterious place that it had been during the Cold War. It was no longer the evil empire, as President Reagan referred to it. But we got lucky because in a kind of a backwards way, I guess you'd say, because obviously in the last couple of years, thanks to President Putin, Russia's gone back on what we used to say was the front pages of the newspapers, now back on the home screens of our computers, our iPads, and our smartphones. With his invasion of the Crimea, meddling around in other parts of Ukraine, and then more recently with him getting involved in what's going on in Syria, allegedly to fight ISIS, but clearly also, let's say, to prop up the regime of President Assad. And so I think people are again interested in Russia, and Mr. Putin has reminded a lot of people, both in America and beyond, that Russia's back in the game, and it's a big player. So we got lucky with that, and I think it's helping our early book sales. Anything else?
Well, thank you all for coming, and we've enjoyed it, and we'll be happy to sign books. We've already signed a number of them. And those of you who are online, send in your orders, and we'll sign them. And they're Books and Books. We'll send it to you, not free. They're free of mailing, but the book will be sold. So you'll have to pay for it.
I want to end with a labor story that has its roots in the south of Florida. I mentioned earlier that David Dubinsky, the president of the ILGWU, was involved with the AFL-CIO. David Dubinsky was a unique figure in the American labor movement. He was an immigrant from Poland. He rose to lead the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And he was in Miami for a union meeting, and he got into a taxi, and the taxi driver turned around and said, "Hey, aren't you David Dubinsky?" And he says, "Yes, I am." And he says, "Well, I used to be a member of the ILGWU. And, you know, I remember you collected a $2 assessment for a strike fund, and we never had a strike." And Dubinsky said, "I owe you a strike."
And I want to add, I can't top that, but I want to add by way of farewell that, first of all, we have some food back there that please eat so that we don't have to throw it away. We've got some more wine. But I am concluding my first extended stay in Miami and South Florida. I've been down here several times in the past. My grandparents actually once lived in Miami Beach, and so I used to come down and visit them. But this is the longest stay here, and I really think that this is a fabulous, just a fabulous, fabulous area. I'm entranced by it. I've lived in San Francisco. I've lived in New York. I've lived, obviously, in Moscow. I've lived in Israel. I've lived in a number of other places, and I don't know that I have ever lived in a more interesting, diverse, kind of wild and crazy in some ways area. And I'm going to propose that Miami be featured in our next book. So that'll be one of the creative discussions that we have.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you guys so very much, and congratulations. What a excellent thing.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. Thanks for watching. I'd like to thank our author this evening, James Rosen, Curtis Harris, and James Ellenberger, as well as our introducer, Mr. Rick Hurst. The books are for sale behind the counter. The author will sign right over here. So thank you so much for coming this evening. Enjoy the rest of your evening.